Chapter 6. She had gone up into the bower where she had kept her things since Lady Asa's time, one morning of early spring. It was a few days before Lady Day. She sat and shivered with fur boots on her feet and a big sheepskin cloak over her clothes. It was now colder indoors than out. Long glistening drops falling from the roof past the opening, and the air quivered and steamed over the glimpse she saw of white roofs against a bright blue sky. She had taken the shutter from the little window to have more air. She could hardly get her breath, and she felt as though a heavy leaden hood lay upon her brain inside her skull. It pressed upon her so that the blood hammered in her neck behind the ears, and patches of red and black flickered before her eyes. She had taken refuge up here for fear anyone should speak to her. She had no strength to talk, but it was some small relief to be able to sit here in her prostration. Ever afterwards she believed for certain that she had known what was coming when she heard the horseman at the courtyard gate. She got up and looked out. That was Arnvid, the one who rode first through the gate. He had his black horse and the ring bridle that he used when he went on a visit. The second horse she also knew to be his, a big-boned grey, which his groom rode. And the third horseman, he who was riding a high dappled roan, was Olav Audunsson. She knew that before he had come near enough for her to recognize him. He looked up as he held in his horse, saw her at the window, and waved his hand in greeting. He was wearing a great black travelling mantle, which lay in ample folds over the horse's quarters and covered his legs down to the feet in the stirrups. He had thrown back the hood, and on his head he wore a black foreign hat with a narrow brim, his fair hair fringing it all round and falling to his eyebrows in front. He had smiled at her when he threw up his hand. Ever afterwards it seemed to her that she had awakened from a nightmare at the instant she saw him. Olav had come home. To her misfortune it was true. He would crush her in one way or another. She faced that at once. But it was as though the blinding gloom fell away from her on every side, and the devils who swarmed about her like the stirring of the darkness itself, so sickly that they jostled each other with elbows and knees, while they surrounded her and led her blindly with them, they fell away from her too. She seemed to know, even as she came down the stairs of the loft, that now Olav was come home, she could do nothing else than tell him everything and accept her doom from him. Olav stood there with the housecarls who had come to take the stranger's horses. He turned toward her. With a pang of wounded pride, she saw how handsome he was, and she had fallen away from him. Those black clothes suited the bright fairness of the man so well. He gave her his hand. "Well met, Ingunn." Then he had a sight of her wasted face, and, unheedful of good manners and of all the strangers who stood by, he threw his arms about her, drew her to him, and gave her a kiss full on the mouth. "It was a long time you had to wait for me, Ingunn, my dear, but now it is over. Now I am come to take you home." He released her, and she and Arnvid greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek, as became kinsfolk. She stood by while the young men cried, "All hail!" to Lady Mannhild. They told her, laughing, that Ivar was with them, but they had ridden from him up by the church, for neither the Gultestad sorrel nor his master was in good trim for speedy travelling. "You know how angry he was with the haste you made in your young days," laughed Lady Mannhild. "But since you have put off that bad habit, Olav, I believe my brother has grown more and more fond of you." "Have I seen such a fair day?" thought Ingunn. The hard snow shone like silver in the spring sun, over the fields and out on the bay. After the mild weather earlier in the week, all the snow had vanished from the woods, and the bare ground shone with young grass, as though newly washed. Across the fields the aspen trees stood with pale green stems within the brown leafless groves. And she felt joy bubbling up in her heart, that the world was so full of sunshine and beauty and gladness. And she had put herself outside it, banished herself to her corner. For all that, it was a good thing that it was so good to live. For the others, for all those who had not undone themselves. And when at that moment she felt a violent quickening of the child within her, her own heart seemed to stir and answer it. "No, no, I no longer wish you ill." They sat at table, and Ingunn listened in silence to the men's talk. She learnt that it was intended Arnvid and Ivar should go, on the very next day, northward to Hafthor Kolbeinsson, and place in his hands the 3rd quarter of the blood money for Einar. Olav held that it was more seemly he himself should not meet Hafthor until he came to pay the rest of the sum, when at the same time he would receive Ingunn and her dowry at the hands of her kinsman. "You have no mind to go farther with us, I guess," chuckled Ivar Torresson. "I believe you have no intention of stirring from Berg till you're driven out of the house." "Yes, so long as Lady Marnhild will grant me shelter and fodder for my horse." He laughed with the others, at the same time giving Ingunn a rapid glance out of the corner of his eye. "Truth to tell, I have had most liking to stay here, make an end of this matter between Hafthor and me, and take Ingunn with me so soon as I go southward to Hestviken." "I have no doubt that could be done," said Arnvid. I guess what you mean, and I thank you for it, but nevertheless I will not ask more help of you, Arnvid, since I can make shift without it. And I must do as I told you at Galterstadt, go south and see how things look at Hestviken before I bring my wife thither, and fetch the money I am to get in Oslo. And it will be far easier to collect the men who ought to be witnesses to our atonement, if the feast be held at the same time folk are on their way homeward from the things, whether you wish that I shall receive Ingunn here or at Galterstadt. Ivar is right in saying that, since this suit has been so long drawn out and tortuous, it should be brought to an end as openly as may be. When folk went home from the things, that was the middle of summer. The thought crossed Ingunn's mind like a whisper from the devils that had had her in their power the whole winter. But now she did not even feel tempted. It was impossible that she could go the rest of that road, now she had seen Olaf again. All that she had fancied of her life at Hestviken with him and their children hovered before her mind. To that she could never return. If she tried to free herself of her secret in the gloom of night and hide it among the rocks, it would avail nothing. Never more could she come to Olaf. Ivar only held up his hands in humorous amazement, as he told the others that Olaf had not yet set foot in Hestviken. Had anyone ever heard of such a man? Olaf laughingly excused himself. He turned red at the old man's teasing, and it made him look very young. He looked younger, more like his former self than when he was here last, though he now had some lines across his straight round neck, and when he stretched, a red scar could be seen under his wristband. And his face was thinner and more weather-beaten. For all that, he looked very young, and Ingunn guessed this was because he was so happy. Her heart sank sickeningly. Would it be a great grief she was bringing upon him when he heard that she had thrown herself away? But he had been given grace. He had got his estate back. She understood that he was a man of some wealth. He had now sold Karatorp, the farm he had owned in Elfsissel, where he had dwelt when at length he had been allowed to return to the country last autumn. It would not be difficult for Olav to find a better match than she would have been. According to the agreement with her family, he would have received no great portion with her, she understood. Olav went out with her when she was crossing the yard to go to bed. "Do you still sleep alone in Asa's house?" "Then it would be fitting if I came in when you are in bed." He sighed and gave a little laugh. "No, we can scarce do that." "What about tomorrow night? Can you not get one of the maids to sleep in the house with you, that we may speak privately in the evenings?" He clasped her to him with awkward haste, so hard that she uttered a groan, and kissed her before he let her go. Ingunn lay awake, trying to think of the future. But it was like trying to clear a path for herself amid a fall of rocks too heavy for her to move. She had no power to think what would become of her now. Nevertheless, she had staggered as far as this in the blinding darkness that lived and moved with unseen terrors, and now she saw the day before her, even if it was as grey and hopeless and impassable as a rainy day in midwinter. Forward she must go. From what she had brought upon herself there was no escape, unless she sought refuge in hell. She knew that she had lost her rights. She had lost them already in giving herself to Olav without the knowledge and consent of her lawful guardians. They had let her know that plainly enough. If her kinsfolk had afterwards been willing to grant her the right of inheritance, this was for Olav's sake, since they had changed their view of him and found out that it was more profitable to accept his offer of atonement and let him take her to wife in lawful fashion. What they would do when they heard she had made it impossible for Olav to take her, of that she dared to think only vaguely. When it came to their ears that she was with child, and the father was a man whom it were bootless for her kinsman to pursue, they would have to let Teat go. They could have no profit of him, and if they would seek him out and punish him, the shame would only be made worse, when it was heard that she had let herself be seduced by such a man. No, she could not guess what they would do with her, and it. But tomorrow, or in 2 or 3 days at the latest, she would have to make trial of it. And impossible as it was for her to imagine it, it was nevertheless as sure as death that when the birch was green, she would be sitting here with her bastard in her lap, and then she would have to accept all that her kinsfolk might visit upon her in their wrath at her bringing such shame on them all, and at being forced to support her and the child. She had bowed so completely beneath her fate that her thoughts of yesterday seemed scarcely real, when she believed she could cast off her burden. Her only thought now was that she must drag this child with her all the rest of her life. Nor did she feel yet anything like kindness or affection for it. But it was there, and she must go through with it. Only for a moment, at the thought that Tora might again claim her for Fretestein, and she saw herself with her child, 2 outcasts living in Hakon's house among his rich children, only then did something wholly new awaken within her, the first tiny stirring of an instinct to protect her own offspring. It was her brothers and sister, who before all others had the duty of providing for their sustenance. That meant Hakon on Tora's behalf, and her 2 young brothers, whom she had scarcely seen during these years while they were growing into men. But now she might perhaps dare to hope that Lady Mannhild would be charitable enough to let her remain at Berg until she had given birth to the child. Arnvid. She thought of him. If he would offer to receive them, he would be kind to them both. In spite of his being Olaf's best friend, he was the friend of all who needed help. What if she told her story to Arnvid and not to Olaf? He could speak to Olaf and to Lady Mannhild, and she would be spared what was as bad as walking into a living flame. But she knew that she dared not do this. How she should find courage to speak to Olaf she could not tell, but worst of all she feared to hide the truth from Olaf. He it was who was her master. He it was whom she had failed, and all at once she felt that, when she had gone through this meeting with Olaf, it would come about of itself that she must fall on her knees to God, repenting her sin and all the sins she had committed in her whole life. Quia peccavi nimis cogitatione, locutione, opere et omissione, mea culpa. She rose to her knees in the bed and said her evening prayers. It was long since she had dared. Mea culpa. She had been afraid of being saved from doing what she wished and accepting what she had brought upon herself. Now it dawned on her that, when she had received God's forgiveness for the evil she had done to herself and to Olaf, she would no longer desire to escape her punishment. The mere sight of Olaf had been enough to make her see the nature of love. She had done him the most grievous wrong, and when he suffered, she could not wish herself a better lot. And behind it she caught a glimpse, as in an image, of the origin of love. In the cup which our Lord was compelled to receive that evening in the Garden of Gethsemane, he had seen all the sin that had been committed and was to be committed on earth, from the creation of mankind to the last judgment, and all the distress and misery that men had caused to themselves and others thereby. And since God had suffered, because of the suffering her own fault would bring her, she too would desire to be punished and made to suffer every time she thought of it. She saw that this was a different suffering from any she had suffered hitherto. That had been like falling from rock to rock down a precipice to end in a bottomless morass. This was like climbing upward with a helping hand to hold, slowly and painfully. But even in the pain there was happiness, for it led to something. She understood now what the priests meant when they said there was healing in penance. Olaf and Ingunn were together in the courtyard at noon next day, when Ivar and Arnvid were setting out. It was the same fine weather as the day before, thawing and dripping everywhere. The snow settled with a crisp little sound in the shrinking drifts, and the yard was full of tiny streams which washed smooth channels of rock in the winter's carpet of horse dung and chippings of wood. Ivar was fuming because Arnvid wished to ride over the ice. It was certainly unsafe in many places off the Ringsaker shore. Ivar had once driven into a gap of open water many years before, and ever since he had been a great coward on the ice. But Arnvid laughed him to scorn. What? In broad daylight? No, kinsman. They would reach Hafthors before it was quite dark. Toiling uphill and down across country in this going, Arnvid swore he would have none of it. If you can get your men to follow you, ride where you will for me, but Eyvind and I will go our own way. but the three grooms were already far down the fields. The winter road from several farms higher up led through Berg and down to the bay. From there folk made their way south to the town, or north and west across the high ground on the other side and down to the ice of Lake Mjøs. Olaf and Ingunn walked down with them. Arnvid and Ivar rode at a foot's pace. The snow was thawed away on the upper side of the track here on the sunny slope, and the water ran down. Arnvid warned Olaf that he was being well splashed. Olaf walked bareheaded, without a cloak, in a sky-blue kirtle reaching to the knees, light leather hose, and low shoes with long pointed toes. His fine footgear was soaked and dark. Ingunn is better clad to walk abroad. I don't know how she can bear it in this heat. She wore the same short, sleeveless sheepskin coat as the day before, and tramped along in her fur boots. Had done no more to deck herself than tying some red silk ribbons in her hair. The air breathed warmly about them on the slope, and there was a shimmer far off wherever they looked. "It was over there we sat that time. Do you remember?" whispered Olaf to Ingunn. Today there were great bare patches of grass. Even yesterday the whole had been silvery white, with only here and there a rock or juniper bush showing. "We may look for a late sowing this year, since so much is thawed before Lady Day." They stopped in the dingle and watched the riders. Arnvid turned once in the saddle and waved. Olaf threw up his hand in answer. He broke off a branch of bramble and offered it to Ingunn, but when she shook her head, he plucked some of the berries himself, sucked them and spat out the skins into the snow. "It is time to go back again." "No. Stay a little. There is a matter I must tell you of." "What is it? You look so unhappy, Ingunn." "Indeed, I am not unhappy," she managed to say. Olaf looked at her at first in surprise. Then his face too became serious, and he looked half away again. "Is it that you think I stayed from you too long?" he asked in a low voice. Too long. She would have said it, but could not. "I thought of that," he said gently as before. "I thought of you when I followed the Earl. I must tell you, I knew it was to share his outlawry. But he was my lord, Ingunn, the first lord to whom I had sworn fealty. It was not easy for me to know what I ought to do, but I lost desire of food, Ingunn, when I thought of sitting down at Hestviken, eating bread and drinking ale, while he, who had helped me to get back all I possess, was doomed to wander an outlaw in another land, and had lost all he had at home. But, you know, I did not believe it would be so many years. Do you think that I failed you when I followed the Earl?" Ingunn shook her head. "In such matters, you know well I cannot judge, Olaf." "I thought," Olaf drew a deep breath, "since I was such good friends with Ivar, and the fines for Kolbein were half cleared off in good English coin, and you are affianced with my ring and gifts, I thought your lot would be a better one where you were. Has not your lot been a good one among your kindred, Ingunn?" "Oh, yes, it's not of that I can complain." "Complain?" She heard the first faint catch of fear in his voice, summoned all her courage, and looked at him. He stood with the bramble in his hand, looking at her as though he did not understand, but dreaded what might be coming. "Have you anything to complain of, then, Ingunn?" It was so ordered that I had not the strength. I am no longer fit for you, Olav. No longer fit for me? His voice was utterly devoid of expression. Again she had to rouse herself with all her force before she dared look at him. Then they stood staring each other in the eyes. She saw that Olav's face seemed to fade, congeal, and turn grey. He moved his lips once or twice, but it was long before he got the words out. What do you mean by that? Again they stood staring each other in the eyes, till Ingunn could bear it no longer. She raised one arm and held it before her face. "Do not look at me like that," she begged, trembling. "I am with child." After an eternity she felt she could hold out no longer. She let her arm drop and looked at Olav. His face seemed unknown to her. The lower jaw had dropped like that of a corpse, and he stared at her, still as a rock, and this went on and on. "Olav," she burst out at last with a low moan, "speak to me." "What do you wish me to say?" he said tonelessly. "If someone else had told me this of you, I would have killed him." Ingunn gave a faint shrill whine, like a dog that is kicked. Olav shouted at her, "Hold your peace! You deserve no better, you vile bitch, than to die." He thrust his shoulders forward as he spoke. Again she whimpered like a beaten dog, stepped hastily away from him, and supported herself against the stem of an aspen. The dazzling light from the snow crust all around struck her with a sudden blow, unbearable. It made her close her eyes tightly, and she felt the pain shrivelling her body, as meat shrivels when it is thrown upon the fire. Then she opened her eyes again, looked at Olav. No, she dared not look at him. She looked down at the briar with the red haws, which he had thrown down on the snow, and she fell to wailing softly. "It were far better. You did it." Olav's face contracted violently, became inhuman. His hands grasped the hilt and sheath of his dagger. Then he tore it from him, belt and all, and flung it far away. It buried itself somewhere in the thawing drifts. "Oh, would that I were dead," she moaned again and again. She felt his wild red animal's eyes upon her, and, terrified as she was, her greatest wish was that he would murder her. She put her hands to her throat for an instant, whimpered softly. The man stood staring at her, at the tense white arch of her throat as she stood leaning against the tree. Once he had done it. The sword had been struck out of his hand. He was unarmed, and he had taken the other man by the waist and throat and broken him backwards, had felt that never before had he put forth his strength to the uttermost. And as she stood now he could see it, the shameless change that had come over her face, over her form, the mark of the other man. With a loud groan like the cry of an animal, he turned his head from the sight and fled up the path. He heard her calling after him, calling his name. He didn't know whether he had cried it aloud or only within himself. "No, no, I dare not come near you." She lay in a heap on the little spot of bare earth by the roots of the aspen, rocking herself and wailing. A good while must have gone by. Then Olaf was there again. Now he stood bending over her, breathing down upon her. "Who is the father to the child you bear?" She looked up, shook her head. "Oh, 'tis... He was clerk to the sheriff of Rhine. Teat was his name, an Icelander." "It were a sin to say you were hard to please," said Olaf with a sort of laugh. He took her roughly by the arm, gripped it till she wailed aloud. "And Marnhild, what does she say to this?" "She laughed so merrily with the others last night." He ground his teeth. "At me, I think. Silly gull that I was to be so glad and easy, never dreaming of such an increase in my fortune. Oh, God's curse upon you all!" "Marnhild knows nothing. I have kept it hid from every soul until I told it to you just now." "That was gracious of you indeed. I was to be the first to know. Now, I had always thought I could get my children myself, but—"
"Olaf," she cried piteously, "had you not come so soon—" Her voice broke. "No one would ever have known of it."
Again they looked each other in the eyes for an instant. Ingunn's head dropped forward. "Jesus Christ, you are not human," whispered Olaf in horror. He straightened himself and stretched once or twice, and each time she had a glimpse of a red scar on his chest near the throat. He said, more to himself than her, "If they had brought me tidings that you were a leper, I believe I should still have longed for the day I could take you home." "Wilt thou keep this woman in sickness as in health?" asked the priest at the church door. "But this, this, God forgive me, I cannot do it." He took her roughly by the shoulder. "Do you hear, Ingunn? I cannot do it. You must tell Marnhild I cannot. And since she has had no better care of you, this has befallen while you were in her charge, so she must herself. I cannot bear to see you again before you are rid of it. Do you hear?" he repeated. "You must tell Marnhild yourself." Ingunn nodded. Then he went up the road. The ground was soaking wet where she sat, and she felt the cold stiffening and crippling her. It was an alleviation. She put her arm about the trunk of the aspen and leant her cheek against it. Now it was time to search within herself for the consolation that was to come after she had told him. But she could not find it. Only a bitter remorse, but not the contrition that brought hope. Her only wish was to be allowed to die at once. She had no strength to think of arising and going on to face all she must go through. She called to mind all the words of comfort she had meant to say to Olaf, that he should think no more of her. When he went out into the world, he must enjoy his happiness without thinking of her. She was not worth it. She saw now that it was true, and it was no consolation. That was the worst of all, that she was not worth his thoughts. She did not know how long she had lain there when she heard the sound of sleds on the road. She struggled painfully to her feet. She was stiff with cold, and her body ached all over when she moved. Her feet were asleep, and she could hardly stand or walk. But she made her way into the bushes and pretended she was eating haws as the 2 loaded sleds drove past. The workmen greeted her quietly, and she answered them. they were folk from the farms above. The sun had sunk a long way toward the west. The light on the snow was now orange, and the rising vapour began to be visible as a low-lying mist. She tramped hither and thither on the road for a while, not knowing where to go. Then she caught sight of some horsemen out on the ice. It looked as if they were coming this way. She took fright and turned toward the house. She was about to steal into her own bower when Lady Mannhild came to her from the other house. To Ingunn's scared senses, her aunt appeared terrible, with her fleshy, florid face surrounded by its wimple, and her stomach thrust forward under the silver belt, with all the clatter of heavy keys, dagger, and scissors dangling at her side, like the time the mad bull came charging straight toward her. She put out her hand to the doorpost for support, but at that moment it seemed her powers of being frightened had been stretched too far. "Holy Mary, where have you come from? Have you been out loitering all day? Rolling in the road, one would think. You are smothered in wet and horse-dung up to your neck. What has come to you? And Olav, what is it with him?" Ingunn did not answer. "Do you know what took him to Hamar so suddenly? He came here and got out his horse. Halbjorn could make nothing of him. He must go to Hamar, he said. But he left his bag behind, and he rode as though the devil sat behind him. It was an ugly sight, the way he used his spurs, said Halbjorn." Ingunn said nothing. "What is this?" asked Lady Mannhild, flashing with wrath. "Do you know what is afoot with Olav?" "He is gone," said Ingunn. "He would stay here no longer, when he heard how it is with me." "How it is with you?" Lady Mannhild stared at the girl. In her drenched clothes, her tousled hair out of its plaits and full of bark and refuse, her face a dirty grey and thin as a scraped bone. She was ugly, nothing else, and the way she held herself in the filthy wet sheepskin. "Is with you?" she shrieked. She caught Ingunn by the upper arm and pushed her through the door, making her stumble over the threshold. Then she flung the girl across the room, so that she fell and lay in a heap by the draught stone. Her aunt barred the door behind them. "I can't guess what you have been doing." She took hold of Ingunn and pulled her up. "Take off your clothes. You are as wet as a drowned corpse." "Oh, yes, it's what I have always thought. Half-witted you are. It's not possible you have your right senses." Ingunn lay in bed, half-numbed, and listening to her aunt's talk as she hung her wet things on the clothes horse over the hearth. It was the first time in all these months she had lain down wholly undressed, and it was such a relief to be free of all these cruel bonds she had put upon herself to get rest. It scarcely occurred to her that Lady Mannhild might justly have been far, far harsher with her. She had neither cursed nor struck her, nor dragged her by the hair. She did not even say much of what was in her mind. Lady Mannhild took it in this way, that she demanded a full confession of how it had come about. Then it was for her to see if some means could be found of keeping it hid. She asked who was the father, but when Ingunn told her, Lady Mannhild sat for a long while perfectly speechless. This was so utterly beyond all she had ever believed possible that she could only think it must be so. The poor thing was something wanting. Ingunn had to give an account of all there had been between her and Teat. She gave short and broken answers to Lady Mannhild's rigorous questions. It was 6 months since she had seen him. No, he knew nothing of how it was with her. She expected the child in 6 weeks. It was wiser to let the bird fly, thought Lady Munhild. And there must surely be some means of keeping the girl hidden here in Asa's house for the rest of her time. It could be said that she was sick. There were not many who asked after Ingunn. It was a lucky chance that she had lived so much in the shade all these years. Her aunt strictly forbade her to move beyond the door during the hours when the folk of the house were out of bed. Dala would have to live with her for the present, and when her time came they would send for Tora. Ingunn lay still and let her weariness overcome her. It was almost good to be alive. Her feet had grown warm beneath the bedclothes, and sleep poured over her like sweet tepid water. Half-dazed, she heard Lady Munhild discussing with herself how they might best smuggle out the child as soon as it was born. When she awoke, she guessed it must be late in the evening. The fire in the hearth was almost burnt out, but not yet raked over. Dala sat on a stool beside it, nodding and spinning. Outside, a storm was rising. Ingunn heard the wind on the corners of the house, and just then something wooden clattered against the wall outside. She was still sunk in placid ease. "Dala," she said after a while. The old woman did not hear. "Dala," she repeated a little later, "can't you go out and see what it is that knocks against the wall? See if you can move it?" Dala rose and came up to the bed. "So, you are yet proud and grand enough to send folks on errands for you, lazy bones. I am here to herd you, not to run and do your bidding. Shame on you, paltry jade." Lady Munhild looked in on her niece for a moment, once or twice each day. She gave Ingunn no more angry words, said very little to her at all. One day, however, she told Ingunn that she had found a foster mother for the child, the wife of a Kotar who lived in a clearing in the woods far to the north. It was settled that Lady Munhild should send for her at once when Ingunn's birth pangs came on. Then they could get it out of the way as soon as it was born. Ingunn said nothing to this, and Lady Munhild guessed it must be as she thought. The girl was only half-witted. Then she was left alone with Dala day and night. She crouched still as a mouse. If she did but move or breathe heavily, she feared Dala would fall upon her with scorn and abuse, all the foulest and most cruel words she could think of. Dala and Grim had never been thralls in the way that folk in old time were, as their master's cattle. But in many places it had made very little difference between freeborn and serfborn, that the latter now had rights under the law, and least of all where it was a question of the descendants of the ancient noble families, and their married servants, who were the offspring of the old thrall stock of the house. It could never occur to such a master or mistress to part with such a couple, were they never so troublesome or incapable, or sick or infirm. Nor had it ever been the custom in these families to sell their thralls. An unusually good-looking or promising thrall child might be given away to a young relative, or a godchild, and a thrall who gave far more trouble and service, or who was guilty of a misdeed, disappeared. And even now the serf-born serving folk hardly ever thought of anything but staying and earning their livelihood where they were born, in the inland districts. The honour of their master's house was their honour. Its happiness and prosperity were theirs. They followed it in good and evil fortune, and the subject they threshed out again and again among themselves was the life of their masters in hall and chamber and bower, every scrap of it they could seize upon. Asa Magnusdatter had had Grim and Dala with her since all three were children, and when she sent them to Steinfinn it was as a gift from mother to son. Steinfinn's lot had been theirs, and since Asa thought that his misfortunes were due to his marriage, they conceived a hatred for his wife, though they dared not show it. Although Ingunn by no means took after her mother, she had come in for a share of their ill will, without very much reason. But Olaf and Tora had been their favourites among the children. These two were calm and considerate in their behaviour to the old bailiff and his sister. Ingunn was thoughtless and flighty, and had decried her yet more in order to exalt the others. And besides this, Dala had been violently jealous all these years that Ingunn and not she should have the care of Lady Asa, and she saw the grandmother's fondness for the girl. And now that Ingunn had brought this unheard-of shame upon the Steinfinnsons and proved false to Olaf, and had been handed over to Dala, perfectly helpless and without the power of defending herself, the thrall woman took her revenge according to her lights. In the crudest and cruellest language she spoke at length of all the things of which Ingunn was only dimly aware, of Teat and of Olaf, till the young woman was scalded with shame and wished the floor would open and hide her in the earth. Whether Ingunn sat or stood or walked, Dala fell upon her with mockery for being so ugly. And then the old woman tried as well as she could to scare Ingunn out of her wits with talk of what awaited her when she should be laid on the floor. She predicted her the hardest of childbirths, and said she could see it in her that she was about to die. Ingunn had always known that Dala disliked her, and counted her a fool, but she had never paid much attention to that, and it came as an altogether unlooked-for blow that the old thrall woman should apply herself to torturing her with such untiring malignity. Ingunn could guess no other reason for it but that she herself must be so disgraced and besmirched and abominable that those who had to be with her were minded to trample on her, as one tramples on a loathsome reptile. So she gave up all thought of peace or preservation. That she might die was the best she dared hope. If only she might be free of this strange creature, for which she could still feel nothing but terror and hatred. She had no wish in the world but to be allowed to die. 10 days passed in this way. Late in the evening they were sitting each in her corner, Ingunn and Dala, when someone came to the door. Dala started up. "No one comes in here?" "Oh, yes, I can come in," said the man who stepped across the threshold. It was Arnvid. Ingunn got up and went to meet him. She laid her arm about his neck and leant forward to him. He was the only one she knew of on earth who would be good to her, even now. Then she felt him draw back a little and loosen the hold of her hands on his neck. And this sank into her deeper than Dala's abuse. Even Arnvid abhorred her. Was she as befouled as that? The next moment Arnvid stroked her cheek, took her hand, and made her sit by him on the little settle by the fire. "Get out, Dala," he said to the old woman. The fiend himself must have put it into Marnhild's head to send that half-crazy witch to help you. Or would you prefer to have her with you, perhaps? "Oh, no," she said weakly. And little by little Arnvid got from her something of Dala's conduct. though it was not much that Ingunn could bring herself to mention. He took her hand and laid it on his knee. "Never fear. You will not be plagued with her any more." But there was so little that he could bring himself to say. He wished that she herself would tell him how Olaf had taken this, and whether she knew what the man would do, or where he was now, or what was to become of herself. But it was impossible for him to speak of it first. So Olaf's name was never spoken between them, though Arnvid sat there a very long time. As he was going, he said, "This is an ill thing, Ingunn. I cannot help you. But you must try to send me word as soon as there comes a time when a man can be of use to you. I would like to have a word to say when they take counsel on how you and the child shall be bestowed."
"There is no man that can help me."
"That is true enough. You must put yourself in God's hands, Ingunn, and then you know all will be well in the end."
"Ah, I know that. And you can say it. But it is not you that are in this case."
She squeezed his hand in her distress.
"I cannot sleep at night, and I have such dreadful thirst, and I dare not get up and drink for fear of Dalla."
"No, no," said Arnvid softly. "There is none of us that has known what it feels like to hang upon a cross. But that robber, he knew, and he hung there rightfully. And you know yourself what he did." A while after Arnvid had gone out, Lady Mannhild came and rebuked Dalla sharply. She bade her remember that Ingunn was Steinfinn's daughter, whether she had done wrong or not, and she was not to be troubled with unseemly prating from a serving woman. And when Ingunn was in bed, Dalla came in with a great bowl full of whey and water, and set it down on the footstool beside the bed with a smack, so that the drink splashed over. But in the course of the night, when Ingunn wanted to drink, she got a mouthful of refuse. It tasted like straw and sweepings from the floor. Arnvid came in to see her next day before he left, but they had not much to say to each other. Ivar had come to Berg in Arnvid's company, but he did not go to see his niece. Ingunn did not know whether he was so angry with her that he would not look at her, or whether any had asked him to stay away, so as to spare her. Arnvid reached the convent of the preaching friars in the middle of the day, and learnt at once from the porter that Olaf was there. He had come more than a week ago. He did not lie in the guest house, but in a little house which the new prior had built in the Kale yard. He had thought that men and women ought not to be lodged together in the hostel, but that the women must stay outside the convent walls. But the women would not lie there, separated from their company and close to the graveyard. Moreover, the house was badly built and draughty in winter, and instead of a hearth, Bjarne had had a stove built in the corner by the door, but it gave no heat, and the smoke from it would not draw out through the louver. It was cold under the shadow of the church and the chapter house, and the thin coat of ice crunched with the jingling of his spurs as Arnvid walked through the garden. Here the snow had now thawed enough to leave the rows of peas and beans standing out as black banks with pale rotting stalks above. The women's house abutted on the churchyard fence. It was darkened by some big old trees, even now, when they were bare. The house had no anteroom. Arnvid walked straight in. Olaf was sitting on his bed with his legs hanging over the side and his neck resting against the wall. Arnvid saw with a shock how changed his friend was. His ashen hair seemed faded, because his whole complexion was now the same, a greyish-yellow, and it was so long since he had shaved that the lower part of his face seemed flooded. Olaf was blighted and haggard all over. The fresh timber walls were still yellow, and there was some smoke in the room, but only a few embers glowed in the stove, and Arnvid felt that he had come into a place where all was wan and frozen. Neither man noticed that they forgot their greetings. "Have you come?" asked Olaf. "Yes," said Arnvid stupidly. Then he remembered to say, as Olaf knew it had been his intention the whole time, he had come to see Finn, his son, who was a pupil in the school. After that it occurred to him that he must tell Olaf how they had fared with Hafthor Kolbeinsson. "How did you fare, then?" asked Olaf. Hafthor had been well pleased with the money. "How long were you at Berg?" Olaf gave his little frozen laugh. "I can see you have been there." "I was there last night." "And how goes it there?" "As you may well conceive," said Arnvid curtly. Olaf said no more. Arnvid sat down, and they were both silent. After a while a lay brother came in with bread and ale for the newcomer. Arnvid drank, but could not eat. The monk stayed for a few moments, chatting with Arnvid. Olaf only sat and glared. And when the brother was gone, the silence fell between them again. At last Arnvid pulled himself together. "What will you do about the atonement now, Olaf? Will you give me and Ivar authority to act for you when the matter is to be concluded? For you will have no mind to come north yourself and meet Hafthor this summer." "I cannot see how I am to escape it," replied Olaf. "She cannot journey alone over the half of Norway and home to me. There might be a danger that the next bantling was on the way before she reached her journey's end." He smiled maliciously. No, it's safer that I take her in hand myself, as soon as may be." After a pause, Arnvid asked in a low and tremulous voice, "What do you mean by that?" Olaf laughed. "Do you think of taking her to you after this?" asked Arnvid softly. "You must know that, I suppose, you who are half-trained for a priest," said Olaf bitterly, "that I cannot part from her." "No," replied Arnvid quietly, "but I was not sure whether you saw that yourself. But, you know, no one can force you to take her into your house and live with her after this." "I must have someone to live with, I think, like the rest of you," said Olaf in the same bitter tone. "I have lived among strangers from my 7th year. It is not too soon to have a house and a home of my own. But you know, it is more than I had reckoned for that she should bring into the household a brat ready-made." "Munhild has provided already for the fostering of the child," said Arnvid softly. "It will be set out to nurse the same day it sees the light." "No. I will not be shackled with any dealings in these parts. I will have nothing to do with any one from here. Neither she nor I shall set our foot here in the north when once we have come away from it. In the devil's name! If my wife has turned whore, I must be able to take her bastard into the bargain." He ground his teeth. She is in such shame and distress now, Olaf, pleaded Arnvid. Yes. We must smart, I think, both one and the other, for the favours she allowed that vagabond Icelander of hers. After a while Arnvid said, Never have I seen a child so wretched and cast down. Remember, Olaf, when you had to leave her and fly the country. She was in an ill way even then. Ingunn has always been weak, had little strength or wit to choose wisely for herself. I know that well enough. It is not that I have always thought her shrewd or firm of mind, but this is still a hard thing for a man to have to stomach. Have they— his voice suddenly failed him. Have they been very harsh with her? Do you know that? No, they have not. And it needs not much to break her. You know that yourself. Olaf made no reply. He leant forward with his hands hanging over his knees and stared at the floor. Arnvid said, At Berg, I think, everyone thought you would put her away. Olaf sat as before. Arnvid dared not bring out what he had at heart. Then suddenly Olaf himself spoke. I said to her that I should come back, to Ingunn. Half a heathen she has been all her days, but I thought she had guessed so much, that we are bound together while we are in life. Arnvid said, When they wished to give her to Gudmund Jonsson, you know that would have been a right good match for her. But then she spoke as though she understood full well. Ah, but now, when she herself has broken her troth, does she expect that I too shall go back on all I have spoken before God and men? She expects she is to die, I believe. Ah, yes, that were the easiest way out, for both her and me. Arnvid did not answer. Then Olaf asked, I promised you once that I would never fail your kinswoman. Do you remember? Yes. At last Arnvid broke the silence. Don't you think that they should know it, Ivar and Magnhild, that you will take her in spite of everything? He received no answer and spoke again. Will you consent that I tell them what you will do? I will tell them myself what I will do, answered Olaf shortly. I forgot some of my things there too, he added, as though to soften it. Arnvid said nothing. He thought that, in the mood Olaf was in now, it was uncertain that they would have much comfort of him when he came to Berg. But he thought he had no right to meddle with the affair further than he had done. In the course of the afternoon, when Olaf was ready for the road, he asked Arnvid, When had you thought of going home again? Arnvid said he had not thought of that yet. Olaf did not look at the other, and he spoke as though he were ashamed and had difficulty in getting the words out. I would rather we did not see each other again, before the atonement feast. When I come back from Berg, I would rather not— He clenched his fists and ground his teeth. I cannot bear the sight of anyone who knows about this. Arnvid turned crimson in the face, but he swallowed the insult and answered coolly, As you wish. Should you change your mind, you know the way to Micklebow. Olaf gave Arnvid his hand, but would not meet the other's eyes. "Thanks for that. But remember, it is not that I am ungrateful." "No, no. You go south now, to Hestviken?" he asked, nevertheless. "No, I thought to stay here for a time. I thought I ought to find out if I am to prepare a homecoming feast or not." He tried to laugh. "If she is not to live, then there is no need." Ingunn sat crouching in the corner by the bed, and it was so dark both indoors and out that she could not distinguish who it was that came in, but she thought it was Dala who had finished in the byre. But the figure did not move after closing the door behind it, and a terrible fear seized her, though she could not guess what it was that had come in. Her heart flew up into her throat and throbbed like a sledgehammer if anyone spoke to her. She struggled to quell her loud breathing and drew back into her corner, still as a mouse. "Are you here, Ingunn?" When she heard Olav's voice, it was as though her heart beat itself to pieces. It faltered and stopped, and through her whole body went a feeling that she was stifling to death. "Ingunn, are you here?" he asked again. He advanced into the room. She could make out his form, square-shouldered and broad in his cloak, against the feeble glow from the hearth. He had heard her groaning breath and felt about, trying to find where she sat in the dark. And now terror gave back her speech. "Don't come near me, Olav! Come not near me!" "I shall not touch you. Don't be afraid. I will do you no harm." She cringed away, speechless, fighting to overcome the terrible breathlessness that her fear had brought on her. Olav's voice was heard, calm and level. "It came into my mind it were best after all that I speak myself with Ivar and Magnhild. Have you told them who is the father?" "Yes," she whispered painfully. Olav said, hesitating a little, "That was bad. I should have thought of it before, but I was so surprised I did not know what to say. But now I have thought about it, it is best I take upon myself the fatherhood. It will surely come out, such things always do, and then we must say the child is mine. We must spread the report that I came secretly here to Berg last year at that time." "But it is not true," she whispered feebly. "No, I know that." He said it so that it struck her like a whip. "And folk will surely doubt it. But that is all one. If they only see, they must not speak their doubts too loudly. You must all say, as I have said. I will not have it that you should keep such a child here in the uplands. We should never feel safe that the story would not be ripped up again. You must take it south with you. Do you understand what I say?" he asked hastily, as she gave no sound beyond her heavy breathing in the darkness. "No," came her answer all at once, clear and firm. It had happened to her before, very rarely. When tormented and frightened to the uttermost, it was as though something broke within her mind, and then she was able to face anything, calm and composed. "You must not think of that, Olav. You must have no thought of taking me to you after this." "Don't talk so foolishly," replied Olaf impatiently. "You ought to know as well as I that we two are bound to each other, hand and foot."
"They told me, Kolbein and those, that there were many good and learned priests who judged your case otherwise than Lord Thorfinn."
"Ah, yes. There is no case that all men are agreed on. But I hold to Bishop Thorfinn's judgment. I gave him an ill reward for his kindness that time, but I laid this case in his hands and bowed to his judgment when it fell out as I desired, and I must bow to it now likewise."
"Olaf, do you remember that last night when you came out to me at Otterstad?"
Her voice was mournful, but calm and collected.
"Do you remember saying you would kill me? You said the one who broke troth with the other should die. You drew your knife and set it against my breast. I have that knife."
"And you can keep it and welcome. That night— oh, you must not speak of it. We swore so many oaths. I have since thought it was a greater sin, all we had said then, than Einar's slaying. But I never thought it would be you who—"
"Olaf," she said as before, "it is impossible. You could never have any joy of me if I came with you to Hestviken. I was as sure of that as soon as I saw you. When you said you would come and fetch me in the summer, I saw that I had time enough to keep this concealed."
"Ah, so you thought of that." The word struck her like a blow, so that she threw herself upon the bed and clasped the bedpost, as she broke into sobs, wailing in her abyss of shame and humiliation.
"Go from me! Go from me!" she whimpered.
She remembered that Dala might come in at any moment, bringing light into the room. At the thought that Olaf might see her, she was wild with despair and shame.
"Go!" she begged. "Olaf, have pity on me, and go."
"All right, now I will go. But you must know it will be as I have said."
"No, don't weep that way, Ingunn," he pleaded. "I wish you no harm."
"Much joy of each other we may not have." His bitterness got the better of him, and he could not keep back the words. "God knows, in all these years, I often thought how I would make you a good husband, how I would do you all the good I could. Now I dare give no such promise. It may well be difficult many a time to keep me from being hard on you. But, God help me, our life will be no worse than we can both endure."
"Oh, would you had killed me that day,"
she wailed, as though she had scarce heard what he said. "Be silent," he whispered, revolted. "You speak of killing your own baby, and of my killing you. You are more beast than human, I think. You lose your wits when you see no escape. Men and women must bear resolutely what they have brought upon themselves."
"Go," she beseeched him. "Go, go."
"All right, I will go now, but I shall come back. I shall come back when you have had this child of yours, Ingunn. Then maybe you will find your wits again, so far that one may talk with you." She felt that he came a few steps nearer, and cringed as though she awaited ill treatment. Olaf's hand felt for her shoulder in the dark. He bent over her and kissed her on the crown of her head, so hard that she felt his teeth. "Don't be so distressed," he whispered, standing over her. "I wish you no worse than. You must believe I do but seek a way out." He took his hand from her and went out quickly. Next morning Lady Mannhild came into her. Ingunn lay in bed, gazing vacantly before her. Lady Mannhild's anger was roused when she saw that the girl looked just as despairing today as ever. "Have you not brought this misfortune on yourself? And now you are to be rid of it far more lightly than you had a right to expect. We must all thank God and Mary Virgin on our knees that Olaf is the man he is. But I say, God requite Kolbein as he deserves, for that he set himself against Olaf's taking you long ago, and causing that silly gull Ivar to be on his side. If they had only let Olaf have you then, 9 years ago." Ingunn lay motionless and said nothing. Lady Mannhild went on talking. "Be that as it may, I'll not send for Holvig at present. Since you are in such a wretched state, we may well doubt if it will live," she said consolingly. "And should it live, it will be time enough to speak of what will be best." On the 4th day of Easter came Tora Steinfinnsdatter. Ingunn rose to meet her sister as she came in, but she had to take hold of the bedstead to keep on her feet. Such was her dread of hearing what Tora would say. But Tora took her in her arms and patted her. "My poor, poor Ingunn." And then she began to speak of Olaf's generosity, and of how black it would have looked if he had acted as most men in his position. Sought to be rid of a wife who had never been given to him in lawful wedlock. "Truth to tell, I didn't know Olaf was so pious a man. He had much to do with the priests and the church. I thought it was mainly for his own profit. I did not believe it was because he was so God-fearing and steadfast in the faith. And he will not claim that you part with your child," said Tora, beaming. "That must be such a comfort to you. Are you not overjoyed that you need not send away your child?" "Oh, yes, but say no more of that," begged Ingunn at last. For Tora never ceased her praises of this good luck in the midst of misfortune. Tora said nothing of what she might have guessed or feared in the winter, nor did she censure her sister with many words, but rather tried to put a little heart into Ingunn. When relief came in a little while, she would find that the whole world would appear to her in brighter colours, and then there would come good days for her too. But she must not abandon herself as she did. She sat there in the corner all day long, never moved, nor spoke a word unasked, only gazing before her in black despondency. Dala had taken Lady Mannhild's correction in such a way that never since had she opened her mouth to Ingunn. But she found ways enough, for all that, to torment the sick woman. Ingunn never dared lie down at night till she had felt under the bedclothes whether anything hard and sharp had been put there. And all at once she found a mass of vermin in her bed and in her day clothes. They had been perfectly clean before. There were constantly cinders and chips and mouse dirt in the food and drink that Dala brought her. Every morning she tied Ingunn's shoes so tightly that they hurt her, and while Ingunn struggled painfully to loosen them, Dala stood by with a sneering smile. Ingunn never said a word about this. But Tora guessed at once a good deal of what had been going on. She took Dala to task right heartily, and the old thrall woman cringed before her young mistress like a beaten dog. And when Tora saw that Ingunn could not overcome her terror if Dala did but approach her, she drove the old woman out of Asa's house for good. She helped her sister to be rid of the worst of the vermin, got her clean clothes and good food. And she checked her aunt when Lady Marnhild grumbled at Ingunn's ingratitude, saying that she herself had had a part in the disaster, and they had assuredly treated her more gently than she had a right to expect. She would put up with no more of this sullen crossness toward Ingunn. But Tora implored the lady. Let them do all they could to make these last days easy for her. When she was on her feet again after her lying in, it would be another matter. Then she would be strong enough to hear some grave words from them both.